So we are going to transition to our first panel. So welcome our speakers to come up to the stage, and we'll get started. It is such a pleasure to meet you all. My name is Geneva E.B. Thompson. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, she, her pronouns. I'm very honored to serve as the first ever Deputy Secretary for Tribal Affairs at the California Natural Resources Agency. I've been at the agency for a little over 3 years now, and my role is really to think about and work and create and implement our tribal affairs policies, not only at the agency level, but then in support of our 27 departments, conservancies, and commissions underneath the agency umbrella. And so it's just a true honor to serve in this space, and really excited to kick off our tribal stewardship strategy, which is our new policy document, looking at how do we advance tribal access, co-management, and ancestral land return across the state of California. And so super excited to have this first training to be part of that. And thank you to our panelists for joining us for our first session. So session number 1 is Weaving the Future, Confronting the Past. Historical wrongs and cultural humility. And so the goal and the hope for this panel really is to do a deeper dive into the history of the state of California, and then how do we use that knowledge and that history to inform current actions that are going to move us forward in the spirit of truth and healing. And so I know Secretary Crowfoot has already mentioned Governor Newsom's apology to California Native American tribes. That apology was issued 5 years ago, and we have been rolling up our sleeves to work on that spirit and that mission that the governor articulated in that executive order for the policy wonks in the room in 1519. And really the task is to identify a specific historical wrong and then map out a policy solution to heal from that wrong. And so today is all about ancestral land return, and the historical wrong that we are working to heal from is the theft of land, the forced removal of California Native American tribes from their ancestral territories and from their natural resources. And so I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, but I also know that it's a heavy topic. And wanted to just start off that conversation, our conversation here today, acknowledging that it's a heavy topic. And so please take care of yourself. No one's going to be offended if you need to step out and take a breather and come back in, because we know that we are breaking down some hard things right now. But I am so excited to have our panelists here today. We have 2 brilliant professors who are thinking about, working, researching, writing, advocating for California Native Americans here in the state, and also thinking about ancestral land return more particularly. So really appreciate you both being here today. We have Professor Kutcha Riesling-Balding from Cal Poly Humboldt joining us from the North Coast, so thank you for being here. And we also have Professor Beth Rose Middleton Manning from UC Davis, and so excited to jump into our panel. Well, first, would love to just open up the mic if you wanted to do any other introductions before we get started.
Green means it's on. Hey, young Kilet, Dr. Kutcha Riesling Baldio Hoyet. Kuya and Afte, Kina Afte, Kusne Afte, Na Tinohe Afte. So I'm Kutcha. I am Hoopa Yurkin Karuk and enrolled in the Hoopa Valley tribe, which is how I introduced myself. But you'll notice that I didn't say Hoopa Yurk or Karuk, because those are not our names or words for ourselves. Those were ones that were sort of placed upon us by explorers who were asking for directions to different things, and so like for instance, they asked the Yurok, who are those people that live over there? And the Yurok said Huepola, which became Hoopa, which means those people that live over there. So when we introduce ourselves to you, we say Natinohue. That means people of the valley. And I think so important to what we're talking about here today. Our people throughout California, we introduced ourselves in some very specific ways. First and foremost, we would always tell you that we were people, human beings. We would say, who are you? And we would say, I'm a person. I'm a human being like you. I'm a person of the valley. That's the place that made me. What we say is that we are made of the earth from that place. We don't come from other places. That's the place that made us. And then we also say that the valley's name, so we call ourselves Natinahwe, people of the valley, place, land, history. We also say that the valley, we call it Natinuf. And what that means is the place where all trails return. And it's such a beautiful thing to think about return, and the way that we always talked about return to home, return to homelands, return to place, that this place would always be here for you, waiting for you to return to it. And that all the trails that you took, no matter how long or difficult or painful, or that they felt like maybe they wouldn't, they kept saying, all the trails come back here to this place that made you, and you'll find your way back. It'll bring you back. So I love that about Hoopa people. But when I asked my grandfather, who was a Hoopa speaker, like, what does Natanuf mean? And he was like, where all the trails come back to. And I said, how would you explain that to people? And he said, I don't know, the center of the universe. And if you know any Hoopas, that's a very Hoopa way to explain the world, that Hoopa Valley is the center of the universe. And I told him, well, that's very Hoopa of us to think that Hoopa is the center of the world. And he said, how do you know it isn't? So that's a little bit about where I come from, but also what I think about as I do this work on land return. I'm always thinking about the fact that we've been talking about return forever and what it means to come back. And I had a reporter ask me one time, when do you think the land back movement began? And I thought about it for a minute, and then I said, 1493. So we've been doing this work for a really long time, but we knew that it was going to happen. And I see that return as being so important to what we talk about today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Beth Rose, Middleton Manning, Afro-Caribbean, Eastern European, grew up in Central Miwok homelands, and now in the Department of Native American Studies at UC Davis. And I'm grateful to be here alongside my friend and colleague, Katja, and to think with you together about dealing with historic wrongs and how much work it takes to undo these legacies of policy, this infrastructure on the land, the pollution, to get to land return and to land care, and to land care in a way that restores and supports communities and families, as well as our relatives around us, ecology around us. So grateful to be here with you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. And so the first question for us today really is, we started the conversation around historical wrongs and the history of California, knowing that the state of California in of itself as a government has perpetuated a lot of those historical wrongs against California Native Americans. But would love to hear your all's insight on connecting those actions in the past and how is that playing out and impacting the lives of Native people today and the sovereignty of California Native American tribes today. We can have just a conversation style. We can, yeah.
Well, I'll start just thinking about being situated at University of California. And as many of you are well aware, academics for the last 100 years have made some very damaging statements, have done flawed research, have forwarded ideas about people, asserting that they're no longer here, when in fact people are here, and there's a lot of work to do. I see in my role at UC to address that legacy. We have, statements that came from anthropologists and others that led to and continue to support lack of recognition of different Native nations today. And there's a lot of correction to do. There's a lot of unlearning. In teaching, there's a lot of emphasis on looking at this was put out. Sure, it was published, it's in a book, but it was wrong. And so we need to unpack how wrong it was, how wrong the method was, and what its ramifications were. A few years ago, we had an effort to rename the John Muir Institute of the Environment. And some people didn't like the idea of renaming. I know some of you may work on renaming. I love the idea of bringing back language and the true names of places. But there was resistance to that, and we had to bring forward, this is what he said about people, Miwok people, and this is what it led to. This is why there's still some lack of recognition. He's part of that. And we can't be doing, I think, environmental research in a space that upholds the name of someone who spoke so negatively about Indigenous people, African American people, et cetera. Very exclusive. So I think those are things we have to directly address. And I hope that our work in Native and Indigenous studies does some of that work. To address those harms directly. I also wanted to mention dams. So I work on dams and the history of dams. And these are examples of huge infrastructure that was put on the land, completely changed the ecology with no consent, no care to this as Indigenous homelands. And when I look through the archives, and part of my work is holding those archives accountable. Like, this is what settler society said about what it was doing. This is what you said. And this is what the consequence was and continues to be, so that we can address it today. So I'll stop there.
I also want to say, as a professor at a university, I often feel very responsible to what it means to exist in an institution that exists because of the taking of knowledge and resources from Indigenous peoples. When we look at the University of California, where I'm an alumni, so much of the wealth that was built for the university was built on the seizing of Indigenous lands. It was also built on the stealing of Indigenous knowledges and the attribution of that knowledge to non-Native peoples, and what it has meant to be now in a time where Indigenous peoples are saying, not only do we want to be the people retelling this story, but we want that to lead to some kind of concrete action. That the reason why you learn history is not because, they always say you learn history so you won't repeat it. But that to me is oversimplifying the truth of the matter, which is you learn history because otherwise it will be repeated. And we learn history so that we can change and build better futures together, informed in a way that sort of says we're not going to do those things over again. And I think the beautiful thing about land back and land return, we were just sitting in a room where somebody working at the state of California said land back in their opening talk. Do you know that if you went back just 10 years ago and came into a room, I was this person and said land back, watch as everybody in the room just started to be like, oh my God, what's about to happen? What does that mean? What is she gonna do? What are they gonna do? There was the sort of the real way that they approached this rallying cry was as if the rallying cry was to displace peoples and not to build better communities. Not to do things that we probably should have done from the beginning, which is, you live here, I would like to live here, how can we live here well together? That's all Indigenous peoples were asking for when they made treaties. We don't have treaties in California. If you don't know about the unratified treaties of California, that's one of the most important places to start, what they did to try to legally erase California Native peoples. And then you start to think about it. I always think about it from a very tangible perspective. It's just a piece of paper that we signed, that we agreed to, that they didn't, and then they hid them. They made them secret. They wouldn't even let us see them. And then they acted as if the people who signed those pieces of paper weren't Native anymore. There are unrecognized tribes in California who have signed treaties with the federal government. And because of a legal loophole, because the Congress said they wouldn't ratify it, people will stand in front of them and tell them they're not real Native people, but they can point to their actual ancestors' signature on a treaty. So that's how much these kinds of things, these ways that we write it down, like what we do really matters. Because when those people were signing treaties, and I actually have a relative who signed the treaty for the area that I come from, the Klamath Trinity Treaty. And he talked about, like, he actually shared with my great-grandfather who wrote about, like, learning this story from him, and he talked about the way that people came to the table and the fact that so much of what was happening at the time was genocide. It was like the fear that you could wake up and be killed, the fear that you could wake up and your kids would be taken. And I always try to bring it back to what it means to be a human being in that situation. I want everybody to remember when you're learning about history, you're learning about people. And those people are trying to make it through something really hard. And I think about how there was a period of time in history where they could have shown up at my house and taken my daughter from my arms, and I would have had to watch her go, and I don't know what I would have done. I don't know what I would have done to try to get her back. I don't know what I would have done. And then to think about how she would have screamed and cried for me and reached out for me and wanted me, and I wouldn't have been able to do anything. And I think about that, and then I think about how they then turn around and say, but that's just what was happening at the time. But to me, that's like a pain that carries through multiple generations, so that when I look at my own daughter, when I walk in the room and stare at her sleeping, I just think about all the daughters that got taken, all of them that never came back, all of them that like were stuck in places that didn't care about them, that didn't want to take care of them, that treated them like slaves in their homes. That I think about that, and then I think about, like, knowing that, how do you also know that there are California Native peoples who are tribal peoples who own less than 1 acre of their own land and their own territories? How do you know that and think that there's any justice in that when we can name like 4 families that own like 3 million acres, 5 million acres of like California, Oregon, and Washington? When we start talking about land back, people will come up to me and they'll say, they'll always come up and they'll go, so like you want all the land back? And I'm like, yeah. And then they go, you like want my house? And then I'm like, sure, I'll take your house. But I'm always like, hey, think about it, y'all. Like, there's literally like 4 families that own millions of acres of places. So why do we like allow for that to happen? And then as soon as you start talking about indigenous land return, it becomes like, how much? What are you going to do with it? What's going to happen? But you don't ask that question of the 4 dudes that own millions of acres over here. So we have to remember how this history like informs even how we see people. And we were human beings navigating that. And we're human beings today navigating what that means. And to always bring it back to that, because I think it's a very human way to understand why we do this work together.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you both. And Kocha, I think the conversation around the unratified treaties is, I know when I was doing my research for the tribal stewardship strategy, I always kind of knew about the 18 unratified treaties, but digging in to the details of that and digging into the details of the state of California's role in advocating to Congress to not ratify those signed agreements, it hurt. And it was so stark in the sense that a lot of our institutions were built on that moment of theft of land. And so for folks who are still learning about this history, the American-Mexican War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The state of California, the lands that are currently within the state of California, then were ceded to the United States as part of that treaty term. And then a year later, the state of California becomes a state of the Union, right? State of the United States. And during those formative years in the creation of the state of California, federal agents came out. They were commissioned by the US Senate to negotiate these treaties with California Native American tribes to create reservations or reserved lands to make way for Americans to settle the state of California. Tribes wanting to end the war and violence against their people were forced to the negotiation table, agreed to take reserved lands as a protection measure, as a survival measure, and signed those treaties. Those treaties then go to the Senate for ratification, and then the state of California's first legislature takes a vote to say, don't ratify those treaties because you're reserving too much land for tribes. Don't ratify those treaties because there's gold here and we want access to that gold. Don't ratify those treaties because people want to make their homesteads here, make their millions here. And so the Senate, in a secret session, decided not to ratify those treaties. But at the same time, tribes were already wanting to keep their word, keep that negotiated terms of their treaties, were already moving to their reserved lands, leaving their homes, and Americans were coming in homesteading and taking those lands as the tribes were leaving. Then those treaties were not ratified, and there was no reserved lands, and then there was also your homes were gone. And so that is the particular historical moment that we are focusing in on right now for the tribal stewardship strategy, for our work of advancing ancestral land return. Because can you imagine good faith negotiations between sovereign governments and just to have that broken in a secret session and you've given up everything? And that has ramifications for people's lived lives today, right? You don't have your homes, you don't have your natural resources, you didn't have the opportunity to build up your nation's economies in the way that others have by having those lands opened up, freed up by the federal government and by the state of California. And so we know that the beautiful, amazing, resilient Native communities here today are also dealing with deep societal challenges because of that theft of land, this theft of resources, theft of economies. It's impacting people's health, it's impacting people's culture, religions, ways of life. And so when we're thinking about the today impacts of that theft of land, it's all encompassing. And we're working to try to slowly but surely address those historical wrongs. And I think that's why I'm so excited to have this conversation here today, because we can be future looking and collaborative solving and moving forward to start healing those historical wrongs. So a huge appreciation as well for the Land Trust who are joining us here today. Because as the Secretary mentioned, you're in a very unique situation to find those creative solutions to move forward in healing. And that was a very long intro to my second question for our panelists. But what does healing look like for you all? When you're working with your own tribe or tribal communities, what do they want to see? What does healing look like in this land return space?
I guess for me, healing is resurgence of culture and ceremony, indigenous knowledge, indigenous science. I think we're doing that work. I have a very clear example in my own place where I live. So I live in Wiyot territory in Gootdini, which means among the redwoods. It's currently called Arcata, California, but we call it Gootdini. And what I love about the story that we have there about land return is they just recently, there's about like 5 years ago, I don't know, it was around pandemic, like before the pandemic, so I say 150 years ago, but they returned a sacred island to the Wiyot tribe, the city of Eureka, returned this island. And that was 40, 45 years in the making. If people think land return is going to be like an easy thing, it actually isn't. I think the whole government system is set up to make it not easy to do. And the more that we get into it, the more you realize every single one takes a very different approach. It's never like one size fits all. And everybody's like, if you could just make like a step-by-step handbook process, then we'd be able to get it done. And I'm like, that's not the way it kind of works because of how land works in general. But if you're willing to do the work, if the first step is, yes, I do want to look at land returned, and the next thing is, it might be fast, it might take 40 years, but the beautiful thing about Native people is we're never thinking in like 50-year increments, we're thinking in like 150-year increments. And so when we started talking about taking down the dams, the scientists were like, there's going to be a long period of time where you can't do anything in the river because if you take down the dams, all the gunk that's behind the dams got to go somewhere. And we're like, yeah. And they said, well, that might take like 150 years. And we're like, cool, start taking them down right now. Then it's 149 years, 364 days to go. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we think very long term about what this world is supposed to look like because while settler colonialism changed this landscape very quickly, our goal was to always sustain and maintain it until the end of time for everybody. So the return of our ceremonies and our culture, that's what that's doing. And the Wiyot, when they started talking about the return of Tuluwat, they went to the meeting and they were like, hey, you should give that island back. And of course, everybody was like, what are you talking about? They also told them that that would never happen and that that was impossible. So what did the Wiyot do? They went and did a ceremony on the island. Because what they were talking about was like, the land knows who we are. And it misses us, and it needs us, and it wants to be woken up. And if we wake the land up, you watch how all the things fall into place that need to happen so that it comes back to us. But we have to wake it up. We have to let it know that we're here. So they went and did a ceremony. And then they would do another one, and then they would do another one, and we would all go and like help them. And then the first thing they decided to do was revitalize their women's ceremony. And they were like, if we connect with the women again, like that's gonna wake the land up. And you just saw how like those things fell into place. We've been given those tools since the beginning of time. Our ceremonies were decolonial actions. They were ways that we could push against any negativity that was happening in our communities. That to me is what healing looks like. Our future generations are growing up in a way where they don't think that land return is impossible because they've seen it. I always say to people, impossible things are happening in our lifetime. We don't get to say anything is impossible anymore. We don't get to come in and be like, so when this building belongs to tribes. And people go, that's impossible. If you traveled back in time and you like got to talk to Thomas Jefferson, which you shouldn't do, right? Because he's not a very nice person. And he'd be like, an Indian is talking to me. But if you told him, like, don't worry, dude, like in 2022, we're gonna have a Native woman in charge of like all of the Bureau of Land Management and all the things, like she's gonna be in charge of the Department of the Interior, like it'll be cool. He would look at you and tell you that that's impossible, that would never happen. And it already has. So we don't get to pretend like land back is a vision of something impossible. It actually is very possible. It's probably the only possibility that we have if we're actually going to do something that's going to make a difference before we get to the point where the solutions are just putting Band-Aids on the end of the world. And instead, how do we want to build a better world? That to me is land back. That's healing.
So to thinking about the impossible and making it happen, I'm thinking about work with Sogarete Land Trust And one of our earlier meetings, we had this exercise where we said, remember when we brought the shell mound home? Remember when we got the shell mound back? And that was years before that was even seeming like a possibility, when it was really entrenched that it was hard to even have that conversation. And now here we are, as Karina described, with it back in the hands of a Native women-led organization. So seeing that possibility just in the last decade turn into reality is really powerful. And I think just being in this space in the state of California, which permitted, those treaties to not be ratified, which enabled the California Land Claims Act, which said, white settlers, come write your name down and take this piece of land. And with that land comes senior water rights that, we still see carried through today, which cause a lot of issues. But being in this space and hearing Secretary Crowfoot say, we're going from acknowledgement to action, and hearing Geneva say, we're changing those policies. How do we envision changing this policy? So I think that's very powerful. I also wanted to mention just a couple other things. One is just a couple other instances of healing. So with Yochadihi, Wintu Nation, last year, they had a cultural fire workshop, a burn. First time in 100 years, fire was brought back into this oak grove, which is now within their ownership. Very powerful to see that, and the healing on the land and in the community, and hopefully to get back this next year and to see how the plants have regenerated and seeing people still coming back out there to burn. Another instance with Diana Almendarez and her daughter and her granddaughter out at the Tending and Gathering Garden, bringing fire back, doing land care in an area that was a gravel pit, that was aggressively mined, by Tykert and or other corporations. But now, 3 Native women passing a coal to start a fire, to restore and keep the tule healthy and the other plants healthy there. Very powerful. And then finally, I've gotten the opportunity to work with the Yurok Tribe Environmental Department over the last several years on different issues of contamination in water and sediments, and seeing their leadership as a department with their staff going out, doing the monitoring, reporting on the issues, communicating with community members, and advocating for change to address the pollution that's coming from illegal marijuana grows, from upstream ag, from timber spraying, et cetera, within their homeland that they never permitted, that had been, enforced on them and is still causing health issues in the community. But to see their leadership in addressing it and being able to work alongside them and try to bring resources from the university and other places to that, like that to me encompasses healing.
Well, thank you. And I just love that. And echoing the bringing back of ceremonies, bringing back traditional ecological knowledges, cultural fire, land stewardship. I want that healing. I want that for everyone. So for the folks who are joining us here today who represent non-tribal entities, land trusts, nonprofit organizations, maybe even individuals, what advice or actions can they take to support that healing you just articulated, to support ancestral land return in their space?
That's an interesting question. I think I will say I differ from a few folks in sort of the work that we do, in that I think it's important for land trusts to understand today that they actually are getting more land returned to land trusts than we are to indigenous peoples and tribes. Like, land trusts are getting land and tribes are not. And that for a land trust to accept that land is actually kind of, to me, unethical, because that is not what should be happening in these spaces. And actually, land trusts should be working so that they don't need to exist anymore, and that only indigenous peoples and indigenous-led land trusts and indigenous tribes should be doing that. And land trusts should be working in partnership to support tribes and indigenous-led organizations to do that. if the power in what you want to do is like, I really want to get involved. I believe in this. I believe in what we're doing to steward these lands, to protect these lands, then that first and foremost comes from the partnership, the true partnership that you're going to bring to Indigenous peoples of this place, who are the most displaced of this region. We know, I always say to people, like, we know Indigenous peoples have some of the highest poverty rates of anybody in the nation. We're like less than 3% of the population. We're the most likely to live in poverty. We're the most likely to not graduate from high school. We're the most likely to commit suicide. We're less than 3% of the population. We're the most likely to go missing. We're the most likely to face violent deaths. You know all this about us, and then we say, can you give us some land back? And you're like, I don't know. I mean, are you gonna like do, like what? So you're okay with us living this way. You're okay with it. Otherwise, you would do whatever it took to make sure that we had the infrastructure and the things that we needed to like uplift our peoples. Land trusts to me come in and say, we can do it better, and not just to say our job is to find a way, a mechanism to return it. That's our job. And that's like the momentum we have, the time we have, the energy we have, the effort we have, the money we have. That's what we have that they don't have. That's what an allyship looks like. That's what a partnership looks like. I also don't believe in co-management. I actually think co-management only works if you're going to give the land back to the tribe and then turn around and go, how can we manage this together? Can we work together now that you're the owner? If you need to remain the owner to co-manage, that's not co-management. So to think about the ways in which we flip these scripts, in my mind, you have to physically get the land back to Indigenous peoples, not because that increases our wealth, which I think is valuable. It's valuable because we are still struggling all the time in our communities, not just because of that, but because when you return it, it empowers Indigenous peoples to feel like they can do things in that space, that they can invite people there, that they can do things that they probably wouldn't want to share with other folks, that they don't feel like they have to walk on eggshells. One time somebody asked me, what about the national and state parks? And I think alongside the treaties and alongside land grant universities and alongside the Land Claims Commission came the seizure of Indigenous lands for national and state parks. Under the guise of what happens with land trusts, we're protecting it for everybody. But that meant kicking Indigenous peoples out of their homelands and creating a very like Disney-fied version of what that land is. And when Indigenous peoples return there, they do talk about how empty it feels almost. There's no love in that land. There's no burning. There's no engagement. There's no ceremony. But the other thing I'll say is like, yes, all the national and state parks should be returned to Indigenous peoples. That's just how it should be. Now people go, what are you guys gonna do with it? Like, what are you gonna do with it? One time I was like, you think we're gonna get the Grand Canyon back and like put up a fence and then take some selfies and hashtag it, wish you were here? I was like, no. I said, I don't know. One time they said, what are you gonna do? I said, I don't know. Maybe we'll charge you to get in, make you to get permits before you can gather anything, make you pay for parking, make you pay for overnight parking, make you say exactly what you're gonna do there, but not let you take anything because you have to make sure you have the right kind of permission. And I was like, all the things you guys already do, what's the difference? Suddenly when it's in Indigenous hands, it's like everybody gets all what's gonna happen. That is why we have to learn about history, because it's a deeply ingrained settler colonial like fear that comes from this idea that everybody operates under settler colonialism. Everybody operates under this idea of like fences, and that is actually not how Indigenous peoples have ever operated. From the very beginning, they were talking about partnership, brotherhood, family, relationship. How do we all live here together? From the very beginning, they were creating those methodologies and ways of existing with the state of California itself. They always came back to the table, even in the most dangerous of times. And what they were saying were things like, could you please stop killing us? Could you please stop killing us? Like, we can all live here together. Can you please stop killing us? And so coming back to the table now, that's a big deal for us. We have to walk into a space where everybody's always looking at us, and then we're starting to ask questions about, what if you just gave all that land back, land trust? And then they get really bothered and offended and sad and like mad and angry and scared. That deep scaredness of Indigenous peoples. We are not a scary people. I'm sorry, I wish we were very scary, but we are actually not very scary. The other thing I think is missing from healing is laughter. California Indians are probably the funniest people you're ever gonna meet in your life. We joke about everything, and we forget that like that humor is a part of how we build a true relationship. So we take everything so seriously now, right? But like in meetings, we would be telling jokes or we'd be joking with each other. Those are the kinds of things that build true relationships. So I always say to people, if you actually I got disinvited from a land trust meeting one time because they were like, what's she gonna say? And I had to send in an email and I was like, I'm gonna say you should give all that land back. If you're here from a land trust or from people that work with land trusts, your first job now is to go into that meeting and say that for us. We can't be the only people that say that. We can't be the only people that put it out there. We can't be the only people that say it's possible. We can't be the first and only voice, because that's what helps us in any space that we come in, so other people know that this is the conversation that we're having now.
I'm not sure how much I have to add to that. That was amazing. I think just those fears that you mentioned, I think they really come from lack of education, lack of awareness. You know, Karina was speaking about that 4th grade curriculum, and that's all that people get, and then it's over. And we are just working right now in Native American Studies to develop a homeland history course. We've been working with a couple local elders on that. And, you know, it's an issue that there's never been a Patwin-Wintun homeland history course at the university, which is within Patwin-Wintun homelands, which stole those lands. And so we're trying to address some of that, you know, to raise that awareness so that when people graduate, move on, become, you know, parts of land trusts or agencies, that's always in the forefront of their mind. Where am I? Whose homeland? What happened here? What role does my institution play in dispossession? And what role could it play in land return and rematriation?
Well, thank you. I'm a history buff myself, and so I really like this idea of understanding the history to inform future action, and appreciate you both on sharing on how non-tribal entities can start to reflect and start to work on seeing where in your space ancestral land return can be a part of your mission, whether it be your agency or your personal mission. So thank you. I appreciate that. Something that, and we're going to be doing a much deeper dive on this topic, but a question I get a lot when talking about ancestral land return, and especially talking about with entities and individuals who want to partner with tribes, but never have had that opportunity to do so. So their first moment of connecting with a tribal leader, their first moment connecting with an elder or traditional ecologic, oh, we got 1 minute left. Okay, we're gonna answer this one really quick. I apologize, time got away from me. Thank you, Megan. What advice do you have for that person? What advice do you have for that person who is looking to build stronger partnerships, but is on the early part of their journey?
I'll just say do your homework so that you're not expecting the people that you're meeting with or trying to build partnership with to educate you. That it's on the responsibility of settlers, of us as people not from here, to learn, to unlearn the lies we've been taught, and to learn and to come prepared to the conversation respectfully and with humility. We didn't quite get to talk about cultural humility, but I think that's key. And understand that people you're setting out to work with have every reason not to trust you and not to want to work with you, and that it's going to probably take a really long time of showing up and continuing to be supportive when asked to do so, to build that relationship. So patience and doing your homework.
Thank you, A.
I always tell people, Native people, wherever you are at, are doing many things. They're likely hosting those things publicly. They're likely throwing big events that they would like people to come to. We would love if people came to things. How many people went to California Native American Day out in front of the Capitol? You got to go to stuff and show your support. You got to go to the days that they hold. You got to go to the events that they hold. You just got to be around. You got to like soak up how it is to be in community with people. The more you show up and then you help, that could be as simple as I helped take all the boxes from one truck down to the site that we were going to. The more you help, the more people get invested in what you're doing. You got to give help before you're asking for things from people. So like, I'm just here to help. I'm just here to listen. Listening is the most important thing you can do. Listening all the time. The other thing I'll say is, if you own like a bunch of land, or you have a bunch of baskets, or you got a bunch of stuff, or you know somebody who does, and you get that returned, you're gonna build a real good relationship with whatever tribe you're working with at that point. Just doing the actual actions are gonna make the thing come forward, right? And then the other thing I'll say is, whenever you're doing anything out in other spaces, the minute you notice that they haven't invited the California Native person to talk, to be a part of what they're doing, to center in the actions of how they're doing things, stop that and say, you have to have California Native peoples in these spaces. We're in the state of California. There are a lot of us. We're doing a lot of things. There's no reason anymore that we can't be the voices in the spaces of the questions that you're asking about us and the questions that you're asking about what you're going to do with us. We should be leading those. And there's so many of us. And I think that that's a good place to start.
Thank you so much. And I know that we're going to do a deeper dive in that particular question, especially for the land trust training room. So if you have follow-up questions, write that down, because we're going to be getting into the weeds, into those training rooms. Professor Middleton Manning, thank you for bringing up the cultural humility piece. I'm going to take a little executive privilege and ask one more question. This cultural humility, the term really is moving away from cultural competency to cultural humility. And the reason why I like to frame that is cultural competency is a framing of mastering and understanding and owning someone else's culture as a knowledge, right? And so moving to cultural humility, it's more of a way of being. It's an ever-growing, ever-changing, learning. It's a muscle you have to develop. And it is being humble and being in those spaces. So everyone has their own personal cultural identities. And we as people living and working and being in spaces together need to build up that humility, that cultural humility muscle, to know that we're not going to fully know and ever master somebody else's culture, but that we need to be in relationship with each other. We need to understand and learn and support each other in that cultural space. And I would love, just as our kind of like closing remarks for this first panel, any reflections or any idea of how folks here today can continue to build and strengthen their cultural humility muscle.
I think recognizing the assumptions that are present in how we do business on a daily basis, like the structure of a nonprofit, executive director, officers, et cetera, the structure of how the agency works, of how we navigate property, getting land back, dealing with taxes, everything like that, that those are built on assumptions and they have benefited people, a small group of people very specifically. And so I think it's important not to just accept these structures. I mean, we have to navigate and work within them, but the fact is that they come from a very Eurocentric colonial perspective. And I think for me, that helps me think about how hard it is, because this is not something that came from communities. This nonprofit structure is not how people necessarily organized themselves and honored each other's contributions to dealing with an issue or making a plan or making change. and yet we're in the space of navigating. So that's how I think about cultural humility, not to just accept even our system of education or how we have to work towards land back every day is itself a problem, and it comes from another culture that was imposed here. So navigating that.
I mean, I think I'll just add, Geneva said it, Kendrick Lamar said it, sit down and be humble. Just when you come into space, just listen more than you talk. And think about it as an opportunity, because we don't share knowledge or space, or none of this is light. None of this, like, I always tell people, if I go into the archives, I live that in my body. I have to look at my peoples. I have to listen to stories about the death and destruction of my peoples. I have to think about that and what that meant. What it meant that on Tuluwat, when they came in the morning after the massacre, this is when they dispossessed this sacred island from the Wiyot people 150 years ago. After a massacre, they went in and they took the land. They took the land from these peoples who had to run and scream and try to beg for their lives, right? And they take this land, and in the morning when they came, there was a woman there, a woman who had survived it. And she was stuck in the mud, surrounded by the bodies of her dead relatives and friends and cousins, people that she had known her whole life. And the question became, what was she doing? And I was talking to one of the tribal elders, and she said she was singing. They found her singing, and I said, well, what do you think she was singing? And she said, I think she was singing a mourning song, M-O-U-R, mourning. That's what I think. And I thought, how do you do that? How do you get to that moment and you just listened to the sounds of all of your people being killed one by one, screaming and yelling and begging, and you wake up in the morning and you think to yourself, I have to sing my people home. I have to help them to the other side. That's the strength that we carry with us when we come into a space, and then we're sharing this with you. It's not to make people feel guilty. It's not to say, like, now this is why you should walk around feeling sad. It's to say, this is what compels us every day to wake up and keep saying, I want the island back. So we're going to keep doing it, like, bit by bit. The more you listen, the more powerful it is. This story comes to you, and then as that happens, other things come to you. And then as you go out in the world, you start meeting other people, because everything is connected. If we just sit down, listen, and listen more than we talk, that's the best place to start.
Thank you both so much for opening us up today. I feel like every time I talk to these two brilliant people, I learn something new. And so thank you for spending your morning with us and sharing about how do we start healing from these historical wrongs. Can we do another round of applause for our speakers, please? Woo! Okay, we had the historical wrongs panel. I know that was heavy, so thank you all for working through that with us and for having an open mind and learning from our amazing panelists. They have done such incredible work in this space, so I'm so glad that you had the opportunity to hear from them. So as we are moving into our training here today, I wanted to just go over some quick training conference logistics. So first you'll see here, we have this slide with this QR code. If you scan this with your smartphone, it will take you to a website that will be a Microsoft form, and that is a space to provide feedback on each panel. We would be so appreciative of hearing what you liked, what worked well, what could have been improved, what you were hoping to learn in that space. There's also going to be a section on that Microsoft form where you can provide additional feedback on the tribal stewardship strategy. And so the tribal stewardship strategy is a brand new policy document that me and my team are still writing, that is looking at how do we advance tribal access, co-management, and ancestral land return. And the end goal of this strategy is to be a tool and a resource for you all in this space to advance that work. And so what is going to be most helpful for us is to know what you need as those tools to help in that space. So we are anticipating having a toolkit, an evergreen website where there's going to be webinar recordings, example, MOUs, templates for folks to be able to use in this space. And the goal is to keep adding to that website so you have those resources at your fingertips to continue this work. And then the strategy is going to be that policy document, right? That's going to have those key definitions, those benchmarks, those goals that we have for the state of California in advancing this work. It's going to pull those tribal affairs policies that we have in the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy, right? They have the core commitment to partnering with tribes to conserve 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. It's going to take the tribal affairs policies that we have in our natural and working lands climate smart strategy, which is looking how do we work in relation with nature to address the climate and the biodiversity crisis. It's also going to take those tribal affairs policies that we have in the Outdoors for All strategy, which is looking at how do we ensure equitable access to our public lands and our natural resources. Pull all of those together in the tribal stewardship strategy, provide clear, workable definitions, benchmarks, goals to ensure that the state of California is moving forward in increasing tribal access, co-management, and land return. So that's what this form is doing, is asking you all, what do you need in this document so we can actually roll up our sleeves and get to work in this space? So really appreciate you all filling out that Microsoft form. Every single panel and training that we have will end with this slide. And so there's going to be another moment to provide more feedback. If you prefer to wait till the very end and just do it all in one, totally respect that and understand that as well. But we wanted to make sure that you always had this QR code in that space to provide that feedback. We also wanted to talk a little bit more about logistics. So for the rest of the day, we're going to be on the second floor. And we're going to have separate rooms with simultaneous trainings. And so the tribal representatives who are joining us today, we welcome you to join us in room 2-221B and C. So that is going to be on the second floor. We have the staircases that go up. If you prefer not to use the stairs and would like to utilize an elevator, let someone know at the registration table. We'll check you in through our security and make sure that we can have that elevator available for you. But in the tribal training room, we're going to be really focusing in and doing a deep dive on what are the barriers, what are the considerations that your tribe should take into account when looking at ancestral land return. And then thinking about what are those solutions to those barriers, to those considerations, to make your lives easier navigating the existing system that we have here today. And then the other training room that we're going to have for our non-tribal land trust representatives are really going to be focusing on how to strengthen partnerships with tribes, how to build, again, that cultural humility muscle that we were talking about, doing a deeper dive on the state policies that are looking at ancestral land return and seeing where your land trust kind of fits into that work. So that room that you all will be in is room on the second floor as well. It's 2-201. Again, you'll use the same staircase right outside. And if you prefer an elevator, please don't hesitate to let us know. And we'll be very happy to guide you through our security so you can have that elevator. So before we break for our coffee and start our next sessions in our separate breakout rooms, I wanted to just have a space just to share a little bit more about the tribal affairs policies that the state of California is working to advance. We talked a lot about the governor's apology to California Native American tribes. But another key policy that came out of the governor's office is the Statement of Administrative Policy on Native American Lands. It's a very wonky document, but in that policy, it directs all of the departments under the Newsom administration to identify ways to increase tribal access, co-management, and ancestral land return. And so that I would highlight as a really key moment and a key policy direction that, when paired with the 30 by 30 executive order that directed my agency and a handful of others to ensure that traditional ecological knowledge was incorporated in the conservation work of the state, to ensure close partnership with tribes in the 30 by 30, the natural working lands, nature-based solution space. Those two policy documents kind of came out in the same time, and that wasn't by mistake, right? That is a clear pathway, clear connection for all of the departments here at agency to really roll up our sleeves and figure this out. And the Land Trust Room, you have a panel talking about those state policies. You're talking about and hearing from state leaders who are above and beyond in implementing that work. But for the tribal room, we heard feedback that you all also would like to get a more deeper dive, right, in understanding those state policies. And so I wanted to just do a little teaser here, but also wanted to let folks who are going to be in the tribal training room know that I'm going to be available all day, and we'll be moderating a lot of the panels as well. And so we'll be trying to weave in those policy discussions. But please know, if you have any questions, I am definitely available and very happy to do a deeper dive in that space. So before we break, I wanted to just take a pause to see if anyone has any questions on either the layout for today's agenda, where we're going, what we're doing for the rest of the day. Feeling good? All right, okay, awesome. And then we're gonna be ending today's day in a roundtable setting. And so the hope is that tribes and land trusts after today, after the training, can come together and start mapping out what those partnerships are going to look like, start mapping out future projects together. And so we have an amazing facilitation team that is here helping to lead that conversation. But keep that in mind as we go out through the day of, like, what are the opportunities in your space to build stronger partnerships and really start to move in ancestral land return. We also have a great interactive wall on the second floor. One of them is called the worry wall, and the other is called the opportunity wall. This is a place to be anonymous, but also to provide some thoughts and feedback. What are you worried about? Is there a particular statute that's in your mind that you're like, man, if we could get around this statute, that's going to open up all of these opportunities? Or is it, do you have a particular board member on your board that is ornery and is not helpful, and you need support on how to get that person invested in this work? And then the opportunity wall is, what do you hope to do? Where do you see those connections happening? What is that land or that moment or that space that you're like, man, this is going to be perfect for land return. I just need to find the tribal leader who wants to partner with me to get that done, right? So please use that space. It can be anonymous. You can put your name on there if you like. It's your space to use. But we will be reflecting back on it in the afternoon to help guide the roundtable conversation and help guide those conversations and help build those stronger partnerships. So please use that. All right. So let's take a break. Coffee and food is outside. Please enjoy. And then we'll see you upstairs at 11 o'clock.